My daughter-in-law looked me in the eye on my 68th birthday and said, "You've been a burden since the day I married into this family. I want you out of this house by Friday." I didn't cry. I didn't yell. I just sat there at the kitchen table with the birthday cake my son had apparently forgotten to buy, staring at the cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago, and I thought, this is the moment. This is the moment I will remember for the rest of my life. Let me back up a little. My name is Roger. I spent 31 years working as a project manager for a mid-sized construction firm outside Columbus, Ohio. I wasn't rich, I wasn't flashy, but I was steady and I was careful, and when my wife Norma passed away from ovarian cancer 11 years ago, I made sure every single bill was paid, every insurance policy was in order, and every cent we'd saved together was protected. Norma and I had one son. His name is Caleb. We poured everything we had into that boy. Not just money, but time, attention, the kind of presents that most kids nowadays say they never got. I drove him to every baseball practice. I sat in the bleachers every single game, even the ones in February, when you could see your breath in the air. When he struggled in high school math, I hired a tutor twice a week for 2 full years. When he wanted to study business at Ohio State, I helped him every step of the way. I thought I did everything right. After Norma died, I stayed in our house in Westerville for about 4 years. I kept the yard. I kept the routines. But the house got quiet in a way that a house shouldn't be, and when Caleb called me one Sunday and said, "Dad, why don't you come live with us? We have the space and Denise thinks it would be good," I said yes without hesitating. I should have hesitated. Denise was Caleb's wife of 6 years at that point. I never had a problem with her, not specifically. She was organized, she was ambitious, she was the kind of person who always had an opinion about everything and usually made sure you knew it. But she treated Caleb well, I thought, and she seemed to tolerate me fine in those early months. I helped around the house. I watched their daughter, my granddaughter Lily, when they needed a sitter. I contributed to groceries without being asked. I stayed out of their way when they had friends over. But somewhere around the end of year 2, something shifted. It started small. Denise began making comments at the dinner table. Nothing you could pin down exactly, but comments about space, about how the house felt crowded, about how her friends didn't have to accommodate their in-laws. Caleb never said anything. He'd look at his plate, or he'd change the subject, and I started to understand that my son had become a man who chose silence when he should have chosen something else. By year 3, I was being asked to park my truck on the street instead of the driveway. By year 3.5, Denise had converted my private bathroom into a yoga space without telling me. I found my toiletries in a cardboard box outside my bedroom door one morning, like I was checking out of a motel. I brought it up to Caleb quietly one evening when Denise was at a book club. I said, "Son, I don't think she respects that this is my home too." And Caleb said, "I will never forget this." He said, "Dad, you have to understand she's under a lot of stress right now." That was the answer. Not an apology, not a commitment to fix anything, just an explanation for why I should accept it. I sat across from a man. I sat across Squant and crossed he was my son, and I still believed things would find their balance. They did not find their balance. The comments got sharper. Denise started referring to me in the third person when I was sitting right there at the table. Does he need his own shelf in the fridge? Like I was a houseplant that had gotten too big for the pot. Lily, who was 7 by then, started picking up on the tension. I could see it in the way she looked between her mother and me, trying to read the room the way kids do when they've learned that the room is always shifting. I started spending more time in my bedroom. I'd eat earlier than them, wash my own dishes, stay quiet. I was 7,300 square feet of a man folded down into one room, and I told myself it was temporary, that eventually something would change. What changed was my birthday. I turned 68 on a Thursday in March. Caleb was in Chicago for a conference. He'd mentioned it twice over the previous month, but I genuinely don't think he registered that it coincided with my birthday until the morning of, because he sent me a text at 6:47 a.m. That said, "Happy Bay Dad, back Friday, no call, a text, 7 words." Denise was home. She was working remotely that day, sitting at the kitchen island with her laptop and her third cup of coffee. Lily was at school. I came downstairs around 8 and poured myself a cup and sat at the table like I always did. And for about 20 minutes, we were just two people existing in the same space. Then she closed her laptop. She turned to face me and she said, "Roger, I've been wanting to have this conversation for a long time, and I think today is as good a day as any." I put my cup down. She told me I had become a problem in her marriage. She told me that Caleb was too emotionally entangled with me to make clear decisions, and that having me in the house had created a dynamic that she was no longer willing to sustain. She used words like codependency and boundary erosion. She had clearly thought about this for a while, maybe even talked to someone about it, because it came out polished, rehearsed, like a performance review. Then she said the line I started this story with: "You've been a burden since the day I married into this family. I want you out of this house by Friday." Friday was 2 days away. I asked her if Caleb knew about this conversation. She said he'd agreed it was time for a change. I asked her where exactly she expected me to go in 2 days. She slid a piece of paper across the island. It was a printout of a senior living community called Meadowbrook Commons, about 40 minutes outside Columbus. She'd already called them. There was availability. I looked at that paper for a long time. Then I said, "All right." I picked up my coffee. I went back upstairs, and I sat on the edge of my bed, and I stared at the wall, and I thought about Norma, and about how she would have known what to do in that moment, and about how she always said that the loudest response to cruelty is a very quiet plan. That evening, Caleb called. I could tell from the flatness in his voice that Denise had already spoken to him, that he'd been briefed, that his job was to confirm the decision and make it sound reasonable. He said things like, "It might be a good change of scenery, and you'd have people your own age around, and Denise and I just need some space to build our own chapter." I listened without interrupting. When he was done, I said, "Okay, son, nothing more." He seemed relieved that I didn't fight it. Maybe he expected tears, or anger, or a scene. What he didn't expect was okay. What he didn't know was that I had already started thinking. I want to explain something about my financial situation, because it matters to what happened next. When Norma and I sold our house in Westerville, we cleared just under $340,000 after paying off the remaining mortgage. That money had been sitting in a combination of CDs and a brokerage account for 4 years. I hadn't touched the principal. I lived off my Social Security and a small pension from my old firm. Caleb knew I had some savings. I'd mentioned it vaguely over the years, but he didn't know the specifics, because I had never felt the need to put a dollar amount on my own worth to my son. There was also the matter of my will. When Norma and I had originally drawn up our estate plan, we'd named Caleb as the primary beneficiary of everything. It was the natural thing to do. But after Norma passed, I'd updated the will to include some charitable provisions and had been meaning to revisit it more carefully. I hadn't gotten around to it, life, as they say. Now I had a reason to get around to it. The Friday deadline came. I packed what I needed into 4 boxes and my 2 large duffel bags. I didn't make a scene. Denise hovered near the kitchen in a way that told me she was waiting for me to fall apart, and I denied her that satisfaction. Lily hugged me at the door and whispered, "Grandpa, are you coming back?" I told her I'd see her soon. I kissed her on the top of her head, and I walked out to my truck. I did not go to Meadowbrook Commons. I drove to a Marriott courtyard off I-270, and I checked in for a week. The room had a little desk, a coffee maker, and a window that looked out over a parking lot, and it was the first space in 2 years that felt entirely mine. I sat at that desk the first night, and I made a list, not of grievances, not of feelings, a list of calls I needed to make. The first call was to my accountant, a man named Philip, no relation to anyone in this story, who had handled my taxes for 15 years. I asked him to pull together a full picture of my assets, all accounts, Current values, everything. He called me back the next morning with numbers that were, frankly, more solid than I'd let myself think about. The second call was to an attorney. And this is where the story turns. I had not spoken to Warren Holt in almost 8 years. Warren and I had been close in our 40s. We'd coached Little League together for 3 seasons. Our kids had overlapped in school. But life has a way of creating distance that isn't hostile, just gradual. I knew Warren had retired from corporate law and opened a small estate practice in Dublin, Ohio. I found his number through a mutual friend. When I called, he picked up on the second ring. I told him I needed help. I told him what had happened, not emotionally, just the fact. I told him about the savings, about the existing will, about Caleb being the primary beneficiary of an estate that was, as of that morning, valued at approximately $380,000 in liquid assets, plus my truck and various personal property. Warren was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Roger, do you want to change that?" I sat across from him. "Ma'am, I want to think about what's right." He said, "Come in Monday." I came in Monday. We spent 2 hours going through everything. I won't detail every legal instrument we discussed, but the outcome was this. I restructured my estate to establish a trust. Lily, my granddaughter, Caleb's daughter, would be the primary beneficiary, with the funds held until she turned 25 and to be used specifically for education or a first home purchase. A secondary provision directed a meaningful portion to Norma's favorite charity, a hospice organization in Columbus that had cared for her in her final weeks. Warren's paralegal filed everything properly. It was clean, legal, and in my name entirely. Caleb was still listed as a beneficiary in a minor capacity. I wasn't looking to punish him completely, and despite everything, he was still my son, but he was no longer the primary, and the asset he had perhaps been quietly counting on, the cushion he may have assumed would land in his lap someday, was no longer structuring itself around his convenience. I did not tell him any of this right away. I found a 1-bedroom apartment in a building in Clintonville. Good neighborhood, good neighbors, close to a park I liked. I paid 3 months up front because I could and because it felt like planting a flag. I bought a few pieces of furniture, set up the kitchen the way I liked it, and started sleeping better than I had in 2 years. 3 weeks after I'd left, Caleb called. He called on a Sunday evening, which told me Denise was probably not nearby. His voice was different, less scripted. He said, "Dad, I want you to know I've been thinking a lot about how things went." I didn't fill the silence for him. I let him think. He said, "I think maybe we could have handled the situation differently." I said, "Mm-mm-mm." He said, "I miss having you around." I said, "I appreciate that, Caleb." He said, "Have you thought about whether you might want to come back?" I said, "I've found a place I'm happy in." Another silence. He said, "Dad, are you okay financially? Like, are you managing okay?" And there it was. Not malice, maybe. Maybe not even conscious. But the question underneath the question was something I recognized. I said, "I'm doing just fine, son. Better than fine." I didn't say anything about Warren. I didn't say anything about the trust. I said goodnight, and I hung up. The calls started coming more frequently after that. First every 2 weeks, then weekly. Caleb started dropping references to expenses. Lily's private school tuition was increasing. The mortgage had gotten harder since rates went up. Denise was talking about redoing the kitchen. He was circling something, and we both knew it. Then one Sunday he called and said he wanted to bring Lily to see me. I said, of course. They came that weekend, just the 2 of them. Caleb and Lily. No, Denise. Lily ran into my apartment and declared it cozy, and spent 40 minutes drawing at my kitchen table while Caleb and I sat with coffee and talked more honestly than we had in years. He said he was sorry. Not fully, not with the depth that the situation deserved, but he said it, and I could tell he meant some portion of it. I said, "I know." I said, "Caleb, I need you to understand something. What happened in that house, the way I was treated, that changed something for me. Not because I'm angry, Because I finally understood where I actually stood. He nodded. He looked at the table. I sat, Prush thought, roll. I've taken care of my affairs. Everything is in order. Lily is taken care of. You'll want to speak to an estate attorney at some point so you understand the structure, but it's done. He looked up. I could see him processing it. The word structure. The past tense of done. The mention of Lily specifically. He said, Dad, I said, I'm not doing this to punish you. I'm doing it because it's what your mother would have done. She believed that money should follow love, and love should be earned. He didn't say anything for a long time. Lily was still drawing at the table, completely unbothered, narrating her picture quietly to herself. Finally, Caleb said, Did you change the will? I said, I restructured my estate, yes. He said, How much did you? I said, That's not the conversation we're going to have today. He sat back. He ran a hand through his hair. He looked older than his 41 years in that moment, and I felt something complicated, not satisfaction exactly, but a kind of resolution, like a chord that had been unfinished for a long time, finally landing on the right note. He stayed for another hour. He helped Lily put on her coat when it was time to go. At the door, he hugged me, actually hugged me, not the shoulder pat he'd defaulted to for years. And he said, I'm sorry, Dad. I really am. I said, I know you are. I held on to that hug for a moment because he was still my son, and I was still his father, and some things survive even the worst versions of ourselves. After they left, I stood at my window and watched Caleb buckle Lily into the back seat. She waved up at me from the window, both hands, the way little kids wave when they actually mean it. I waved back. I thought about Norma. I thought about the 31 years I spent building something steady. I thought about the morning I sat at a kitchen table with a cold cup of coffee while my daughter-in-law handed me a printout of a nursing home like she was returning a library book. And I thought, she gave me a gift that morning. She just didn't know it. Because the moment she told me I was a burden was the moment I stopped carrying weight that was never mine to carry. And the moment I walked out of that house with my 4 boxes and my 2 duffel bags was the moment I started, for the first time in years, living a life that was entirely, unapologetically mine. I don't have a dramatic ending to offer you. Denise never apologized. She and Caleb are still together. Lily visits me every other Sunday now, and we bake, and she tells me about her friends at school, and she has started calling my apartment the Good House, which I think is the best review I have ever received. My account of the brokerage firm grows quietly. My apartment is clean and warm. I sleep without tension in my shoulders for the first time in 2 years. And every so often, Caleb calls with a question that is really a different question underneath, and I answer the question on the surface calmly and kindly, and I let the other one go unanswered, because some things a man keeps to himself, not out of cruelty, out of dignity. I keep coming back to that kitchen table, the cold coffee, the printout sliding across the island like I was a transaction being closed out. Denise had clearly rehearsed it. She used clean, clinical words, boundary erosion, emotional entanglement, and in the moment I think she believed those words made what she was doing reasonable, maybe even kind. But here's what I've learned about cruelty dressed up in careful language. The packaging doesn't change what's inside. I think about the choices that led to that morning, and I don't just mean Denise's choices. I mean mine. I stayed quiet too long. I folded myself into a smaller and smaller shape, trying to keep the peace in a house where peace was never actually on offer, and it's something I had to be honest with myself about. I let it happen because I confused love with tolerance. I thought enduring mistreatment quietly was a form of loyalty. It wasn't. It was just endurance. Those are not the same thing. What changed everything wasn't anger. It was clarity. The moment I sat on the edge of that hotel bed and started making my list, not of grievances, but of calls, something shifted in me that I can only describe as my own self coming back online. I stopped asking what I had done wrong and started asking what I was going to do next. That distinction, small as it sounds, is everything. Caleb is a good man in the way that a lot of people are good, meaning he's capable of it, but it requires more courage than comfort usually allows. He chose the easier path for years. He looked at his plate when he should have spoken up, and the hard truth is that I enabled that too, because I never made the cost of his silence visible to him. When I finally did, not through anger, not through ultimatums, but through quietly restructuring my estate and building a life that didn't depend on his approval, something woke up in him. He started showing up differently, not perfectly, but differently. That's what I want people to take from this, if anything. Not that you should rewrite your will the second someone hurts you, but that your life, your resources, your time, your dignity, these belong to you. Protecting them isn't selfishness, it's integrity. It's the kind of moral backbone that, in my experience, nobody teaches you directly. You develop it by watching what happens when you abandon it, and then deciding you won't do that again. I think about Norma a lot in that apartment in Clintonville. She was the smarter one always. She used to say that the most powerful thing a person can do when they've been underestimated is simply prove it quietly over time. No announcement, no performance, just results. I'm 68 years old. I sleep well now. My granddaughter calls my apartment the good house. I have enough, and I know exactly where it's going when I'm gone. That's not revenge. That's just a man finally living on his own terms.